Thanos, the supervillain in the blockbuster Avengers Endgame movie, killed off half the beings in the universe to solve overpopulation. Did he solve the problem? Should the Avengers undo his deed if they can?
We'll get into this next on the GrowthBusters podcast.
Calling. Call a GrowthBuster. Whoa.
Welcome to the GrowthBusters podcast about sustainable living. Here, we explore ways to shrink our own individual footprints, as well as make changes that we need to make in our growth-addicted system. For cutting-edge information about our culture's unsustainable love affair with growth and what we can do about it, visit growthbusters.org. I'm Dave Gardner, and I'm joined today by my partner in growth busting, Erika Arias. How are you today, Erika?
Hi, doing well, Dave. How are you?
Fantastic. Before we get to the main event, we try usually to share some listener feedback. This is an email we got from Keith McKenzie in France. Keith wrote, "Thanks for your website and podcasts. I was listening to the one about taking food off the table in April, and there was one phrase that struck me. The man, Michael Brownlee, that you were in discussion with, included big government in with industrial agriculture, industrial food production, etc. This term, big government, is a gift for the likes of Trump that would destroy the EPA, etc. Also, Brexiteers. What we need is good government. Big or small is irrelevant. This term invites digressions, does not specify anything useful. Big government could be a fantastic government or a terrible one. The same for small. And by the way, think India or Africa for small government. Regardless of size, when government functions well, we don't know it's even there. Thanks for everything, and let's stop vilifying government and fix it. It's the only way we can get it to work for us rather than corporate interests. I would love you to pass on my thoughts to Mike Brownlee. I am getting involved with transition, but it's in French, makes it slow for me."
Oh, that was nice. Thanks for writing to us.
Yeah, good thoughts, and I'll make sure that we put that in front of Michael, and really good points. I always like to say, government is us, It's just us collectively getting together and trying to do things better than we can do individually, and there are certain things that we've got to get together to do.
Yeah.
I just saw Avengers Endgame. Have you seen that?
Yeah, saw it last weekend. What'd you think?
Well, it's interesting that we're recording this podcast just 2 weeks after it opened, and this is a blockbuster, a serious blockbuster. It's already made $621 million in the United States alone. Worldwide total gross, $2.2 billion. That's just at the 2-week mark. By the time you're listening to this podcast, it'll probably be the biggest grossing film of all time. I'm not really big on superhero movies to begin with. Is that up your alley?
Yeah, neither am I. I actually went in watching it with a clean slate. I had never seen any of those superhero movies before this one. And I think the main points I got, maybe not things between the characters and their backgrounds, but it was a very well done movie.
This is a 3-hour movie. 3 hours, I sat in my seat, and I did not once have to get up and go have a pit stop.
Likewise.
You're a lot younger than me. You probably take that for granted. I don't.
No, I am queen of the bathroom. I visit every seat along the way, and my friends actually made fun of me. Like, "Are you sure you don't have to go?" I'm like, "No, I'm sure." So I'm very proud of myself as well.
There was no intermission, but there was nobody for me I went alone to see the film, and so I didn't have anybody to fill me in when I got back from the bathroom, so I was determined not to go, and that might say something for how engaging the film is.
Yeah.
So if you haven't seen it yet, I think it's fair to say that we're going to do spoilers here in this conversation, don't you think?
Yeah, so maybe just a little disclaimer, if you haven't seen the movie, wait to listen to this episode.
Yep. Stop right where you are, go see the film, and then come right back and start listening to this episode of the GrowthBusters podcast. And we're also going to do a little bit of spoiler for the prequel, if you haven't seen that came out a year ago, which was Avengers Infinity War. That film left us with a bit of a cliffhanger. Here comes the first spoiler for that film, and that was the villain, Thanos, who is really a great movie villain. At the end of the movie, he vanished half of all of the living creatures in the universe. He did away with them. They dissolved, and that was the last thing we saw in the film, so we knew there was going to be more. There was going to be a sequel, and sure enough, they came out with Avengers Endgame. But we want to talk about this because why did Thanos eliminate half of the living creatures of the universe? It was because he was concerned about overpopulation. He knew there weren't the resources to support a huge population of human beings, and I suppose of other living creatures, but I think human beings, safe to say human beings were the biggest villains, bigger villains than Thanos in this. And so he did away with half the people. So I was really curious to find out what the Avengers were going to try to do about that, if there was anything to be done. So you knew that. You knew that much when you went in because you had read some of the write-ups about that.
Yeah, that is kind of what I did my research on, just the end of that movie and trying to find themes that were based on that film. I actually went in watching Endgame with the expectation that there would be more about overpopulation in the movie. And actually, I did. I found themes within the movie, but there wasn't a lot.
Well, you're right. They don't really hit you over the head with that. And I found myself wondering whether the general movie-going public might be able to just go and be entertained by a movie like this and not be inspired to think about overpopulation or even have any conversations about it when they get out of the film. Do you think that's likely?
I don't know. I mean, before I went to go watch the movie, I had done my research on Infinity War. And with the people that I knew that were going to watch the movie before I was going, I actually brought up the topic of overpopulation and expressed my excitement to watch the movie because that was something I was anticipating. Oh, they're actually going to talk about this in a movie that is going to be popular among so many groups of people. And it's important. It's important that it is a topic that we talk about. And the feedback I was getting, that is something that they talk about more in Infinity War, but I don't think they're going to really talk about it too much in this upcoming movie because the goal is to bring all the people back. They're not going to be talking about this. I mean, that was a very bad thing that happened in Infinity War, and I don't expect to see that happen in Endgame. So yeah.
Well, a big blockbuster film like this obviously has the potential to generate public awareness and thought and discussion about the issues that it visits. So I was certainly curious to see how obvious it was and how it made me feel. And obviously, it's making people like us have conversations about it. And we want to talk about overpopulation because that is, half of the sustainability equation. There's really two things that we're constantly talking about on the podcast, as you know, Erika, and they are overpopulation and overconsumption, because you multiply those together to get the full impact of human civilization on the planet. And if we are in overshoot, unsustainable mode, then so deeply into overshoot, then we need to be acutely aware of both of those problems and doing everything we can to solve them, short of murdering half the people in the universe, probably.
Right. Maybe that wasn't the best way to solve the problem, but it was very drastic. I don't think he had any other, I don't want to say he didn't have any other option, but sure, there's other options, which is why we're here. But yeah, that was a little bit of a drastic solution.
Yeah. But we're here to analyze that. And the good news is that if the general movie-going public didn't head over to lunch or to coffee or to have a drink after the movie and have a serious sit-down conversation about other better solutions to overpopulation, then at least Dave and Erika are going to have that conversation. And, of course, I did a little Googling around to see what other people were saying about it, and certainly there have been some other people who have been publishing commentaries that do touch on that subject, fortunately.
Yay. I kind of wanted to say a quote, actually. I just finished reading a book called Manswarm by Dave Foreman and Laura Carroll.
Good book.
Yeah, and that was on my list, so I finished that, and I really like this quote, so I'll go ahead and share it. It's, "Growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of the cancer cell." And that is by Edward Abbey.
One of my heroes. Yep.
Yeah. I really like that quote because whenever the topic of overpopulation comes up, I mean, somebody I actually had dinner with earlier this week, somebody I very much respect and admire, evolutionary anthropologist, friend of mine and mentor, And I really, really like what she had to say about it. And this is some food for thought, Dave. I'd like to hear your response to it, actually. Her thought on this was, yeah, we can talk about overpopulation, but really this is an issue of politics. There is more than enough food in this planet for everyone to feed everyone. But really what we have is an issue of politics and distribution of resources. And in part, I agree with that. But I don't know if it is even possible for human nature to actually be able to distribute resources. If our goal is to survive and reproduce and to fend for ourselves and our own families, I mean, how much can we really rely on human nature to distribute resources fairly amongst all people on this planet without paying attention to human numbers? I don't know if that's possible. It's a nice idea, sure, but I don't think it's really possible.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because that actually was brought up in one of the commentaries that I read that I want to talk about a little bit during this episode. And certainly I hear that from time to time, particularly from people who are either just uncomfortable talking about overpopulation, so they're trying to change the subject, or who really genuinely don't believe the overpopulation is the problem, and so they're trying to convince us to stop talking about it and start working on the unequal distribution. And I agree that today we are growing enough food to feed everyone on the planet much better than we do today, that we do have a distribution problem. But even if human nature was better, and I always hope it is, than we've demonstrated so far, I don't know how perfect we can get distribution. Even if we wanted to, can we achieve perfect distribution? But we really don't even, I don't think, have to even debate that, because you've got to really stop and say, okay, how is it that we're growing enough food on the planet today to feed 7.7 billion people? Well, the way we're doing it is by killing the planet. We're pumping aquifers dry, we're pumping major rivers dry, we're liquidating fertile soil. The only way that soil is even putting up any crops today is that every year we artificially add all of these
genetically modified
chemicals to the soil, to make it grow crops again. And the conventional wisdom out there is that we've only got about 30 harvests left before the soil is just done. And of course, we're growing all this food largely through mechanized industrial agriculture. We're burning a lot of fossil fuels. In doing that, we're disrupting the climate. The global industrial food system, as mentioned in that episode about taking food off the table that I did with Michael Brownlee, it is the biggest contributor to carbon emissions on the planet. It can't continue. It can't. It doesn't get us off the hook on overpopulation, because if we keep on reproducing like rabbits, or even if we stabilize human population at 7.7 billion people, within the next few decades, we would have to change the food system in order to have a survivable climate, and then we wouldn't be able to feed everybody. Or in 20 or 30 years, the agriculture system just will stop creating that kind of bounty, and then we would have mass starvation. So equal distribution ain't going to solve those problems.
Right. And then the argument of affluence and how richer nations are the ones that are consuming the most, and everybody else over the world are not consuming even like half of what we're consuming. We should be setting the example, but we're not.
Sure.
So there's a long way to go, and I don't think you can get there without recognizing the number aspect of it.
Yeah, and I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't work on eliminating waste and eating a whole lot less meat and giving room for the most impoverished people on the planet to have more food, better food, healthier food, and better lives. We definitely should be working on that. But that will be a short-term game if we're not also working on resolving the overpopulation issue too. Right. So the movie opens, and it is a little confusing, and I think my interpretation is that we're still kind of toward the tail end of the destruction that was happening at the end of Infinity War, that there are actually people who haven't yet been eliminated, because we have this great, beautiful, idyllic family scene. It looks like it's on a family farm or something like that, with a dad and wife and a couple of kids and they're working on a picnic, and the father and husband of this family is actually one of the Avengers, Clint Barton, or his superhero name is Hawkeye. His family evaporates right there. I mean, they're getting ready to sit down for a nice picnic lunch, and all of a sudden his whole family is gone. And I'm pretty sure that was the tail end of Thanos vanquishing half of the population of the universe. And it struck me, and I wanted to mention that because what I think that does, and I'm pretty sure this was intentional, is it really drives home how cruel this overpopulation solution is. It is cruel. If the solution to overpopulation is that we have to murder people, that people have to commit suicide, or we have to just take people out. Yeah, that is very cruel. And so the film drove home that point, I think, right there in the opening scene.
Yeah, and I guess if you're not critically looking at Thanos and you're just accepting that he is the supervillain, then yeah, it's very easy to say, whoa, like, overpopulation is not a conversation we should be having. Just look at what Thanos did. He's a horrible person. It's very easy to point the finger at him. And especially with creating such a idyllic scene like that. Well, who wants their family to be wiped out out of nowhere? No one.
Pretty sad.
So he was very sad. Yeah.
So I agree that is a really cruel solution. So I don't take exception to having that scene in the film, but that was just the first of many things in the film that I think kind of do undermine the acute awareness that I think we'd like to see, but we'll get to that shortly. So you were struck by Thanos more than once in this movie saying, "I am inevitable."
Yeah, that kind of happened. Twice, 3 times maybe. And if you've seen the movie, you remember Stark dies in the process of taking the stones back from Thanos, and right before Thanos says, "I am inevitable," and Stark says, "And I'm Iron Man," and then he dies. But I think it's important to look at the words "I am inevitable," because I took that and I just thought, wow, I think that is just really symbolic of the evil associated with overpopulation and how that is inevitable. It is inevitable if we continue to grow without limits. All of the evil associated with overpopulation, whether somebody makes it their purpose to kill off half the population or whether it just sort of happens on its own, it is inevitable.
Ding, 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 ding. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. I think you nailed it. Yeah.
And I guess adding to that, someone, of course, had to die. Unfortunately, it was 2 people. It was not just Stark. It was Black Widow. 2 people had to die, or they had to be sacrificed so that the people could get what they wanted. The people wanted half of the population to come back. That's what they got. But in exchange for that, 2 people had to be sacrificed. So is it worth it? And also, it was 2 people right now, but how many people is it going to be in the future for the people to get what they want? There was no solution at the movie. They got what they wanted, and it was a happy ending, but nobody ever addressed the why that even happened in the first place. It was never brought up. And that was sort of bothersome for me.
Yeah, and I definitely want to circle back to that whole happy ending thing. For some reason, though, I'm uncomfortable going straight to that. I have a couple of little, just really pretty minor observations about some fun things that I observed in the movie before we get there. And I don't know if you do too either. Are there some other little bits and pieces before we talk about this quote-unquote happy ending?
I think another symbol in the film, in order to beat Thanos at the end, everybody kind of had to come together. Everyone from every movie prior. It was everybody. And so I think that's sort of symbolic how this entire planet needs to come together to solve this problem. It's not just a one-man job. It's everybody. We all have to be on the same page to do something about it. So to overcome overpopulation, everybody has to come together on the same mission.
I didn't get that. I was just thinking, wow, this movie must have cost a lot of money to make. Just think of the salaries for all those performers.
Yeah, it was everybody. And it was kind of cool, too, because having never watched any of the movies before this one, I still recognized characters like Black Panther and all of the other Marvel characters. Just knowing, just from pop culture and hearing people talk about these movies that they went to go watch, it was pretty neat to see everybody. So yeah, It was a very expensive movie.
Yes, indeed.
Sounds like it's making its money back, though.
Yep, I don't think they have to worry about getting past the break-even point. Okay, so I'll offer a detailed observation that I thought was really kind of interesting. One of the first things among the ruins, when we see the Earth after Thanos has wiped out half of the population of the universe, we see a kind of a ruined Prius on the side of the road. Did you notice the first motor vehicle in the scene? And Earth really looks pretty devastated, but there's this Prius that's smashed up and obviously failed, not running anymore. And I thought to myself, okay, I think they intentionally made it a Prius as kind of a commentary that, well, just driving hybrid cars didn't solve the overpopulation problem.
I like that. Yeah. Wow. Excellent observation.
Anyway, I thought that was pretty interesting. Another one, also pretty early in the film, Captain America notes a whale sighting, and he comments, whales, fewer ships, cleaner water. And I think, that really was about the only reference in the whole film about the benefits of not having an overpopulated world, not having too many humans.
Yeah. I can't think of any others, but yeah. Funny you said that, because I thought of him as like sort of the hyper-optimist of the group.
Yeah.
Which is good. It makes him a very good hero. But I think there are also problems with hyper-optimism and not really seeing potential problems. The movie also kind of made me think about morality and how everybody is sort of guided by whatever they think is right. And nobody really is a villain in their own narrative. Thanos certainly wasn't a villain. I don't think it made him happy to kill off half of the population. He did it because he thought it was right. He thought it was the moral thing to do. And the same thing with the Avenger characters. Like, they thought that getting half of the population back was the good thing to do, the moral thing to do. But I think the latter, it's a lot easier to consider that a more moral thing because it doesn't involve death. It involves bringing people back and reuniting them with their families. And I think that's relatable to most people.
Well, let's talk about that then, because that's kind of related to the happy ending. And I found the most interesting writing about that was actually in a piece, and I'll include a link in the show notes, a piece at Forbes written by a science writer, V Chenery, and it was called The Science of Avengers Endgame Proves Thanos Did Nothing Wrong. And I'll share with you a couple of points that he makes. He actually got so much about it right until he finally does get it wrong.
Aww.
So I want to give him some kudos, but I also want to admonish him a little bit for getting a couple of things wrong. But the thing that I agree about is that, and I think it's pretty much unquestioned, is that, well, yeah, of course, if there's a way to save these lives, if we can bring these people back and undo the evil that Thanos did, then we should do that. And I don't think I would argue with that, because I don't really like the solution to overpopulation that Thanos came up with, which was mass murder. And yet, I guess the thing that bothered me was that, it was a happy ending. They bring everybody back. We're way overpopulated, but nobody cares. It's not even a footnote.
And they're not really experiencing all the problems of overpopulation. And it sort of makes sense for them to look at this as a solution. And it sort of makes sense for them to want to have half of the population. Because if you notice, right after everybody was gone, half of the people were gone, they sort of made it into this very dark, unpleasant place to live in. Like, oh no, this is not life. This is a very scary, sad, dark place.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's necessarily true. I mean, one could argue that it could be a very sad, dark, scary place when the world is overpopulated, and not so much when, yeah.
Yeah, good point. So let me share a couple of the things that I think V Chenery got right in this Forbes piece. He asks, is Thanos right about overpopulation? His rationale seems to make sense if we consider our own planet. Fewer people ought to mean more food and less hunger, and might lower the risk of an epidemic when overcrowding enables the spread of disease. Human activity is driving a loss of biodiversity, with about 25% of animals and plants now threatened with extinction. So having the population would help other species. As a consequence, you could conclude that by eliminating 50% of all humans, Thanos did the Earth a huge favor. Well, I wouldn't argue with that. Later on, he asks, would removing half the human population really benefit the planet? According to the latest report from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, it's a mouthful, IPBES, who actually just published a week ago, at the time that we're recording this podcast, the summary of a more extensive report that is yet to come out. They're telling us that the rate of species extinctions is accelerating, a dangerous decline driven by 5 factors: land use, hunting or exploiting wildlife, climate change, pollution, and introducing invasive species. Nothing about just too many humans on the planet, unfortunately, there. But here's what the author of this piece really gets right. He wrote, "The Avengers are guilty of putting the grief of survivors above the health of our world. From the planet's point of view, it's the superheroes who are the bad guys. Reversing Thanos' actions is a selfish endeavor that reflects the fact that we humans put ourselves at the center of everything, a philosophical viewpoint called anthropocentrism. Nonetheless, we can still ask whether a smaller population would reduce suffering in the surviving people." So I was glad he pointed out that.
How selfish are we to think that we could just have as many people as we want here at the expense of the planet that we all call home? Yeah, I really like that he said that too.
Yeah, but then he goes off the rails. I don't know what happened. He must have stopped taking his meds or something, because he went on to write...
Somebody gave him some really bad notes and he just changed his whole direction.
I guess, darn it. Overpopulation is a controversial concept, he writes. It assumes that Earth has a natural carrying capacity, a maximum number of people the planet can support, because food and other resources are finite. That assumption might not be justified, however, as there's no strong scientific evidence that our world couldn't carry more humans. What? There's no strong scientific... Correct me if I'm wrong, Erika. I think the scientific evidence is overwhelming.
Yes, the scientific evidence tells us that climate change is a real crisis right now. We're not going to even call it climate change. We're going to call it a climate crisis, and that is largely anthropogenic. And for anybody that doesn't know what that means, that just means that our human impact has exceeded what the planet can handle. And unfortunately, our planet is getting hotter, and there are limits. So, wow.
So he doesn't stop digging. He continues to dig.
How did this get published?
But this kind of stuff is all over. It's the internet, you know? So he goes on digging, and he says, some experts argue that the residents of rich, developed countries consume more than they need, so the real problem is overconsumption. Well, a problem is overconsumption. That's not a problem that supersedes overpopulation, you know? And I can't believe this science writer who had some real good insights about the film goes down into this dark rabbit hole. Yeah. Oh, I thought you were doing a sound effect for us, the buzzer that we're gonging him. We're going to eject him from the universe. So he goes on. So he says, in trying to oversimplify the issue as overpopulation, Thanos did make one mistake. Snapping his fingers seemed to erase 1 in every 2 people at random. If overconsumption is the real problem, Thanos should have targeted people from wasteful nations, leaving a better world for the 50% who survived the snap. Actually kind of makes a point there. I mean, that would address the overconsumption problem if we had to do mass murder in order to solve overpopulation. We might as well eliminate the real big pigs on the planet. Us.
Yeah. Well, yes, I agree. Like, educating people on overconsumption is very important, but that pairs with also recognizing that overpopulation in itself is a problem, and you can't have one without the other. It's like, how likely are people to just change their behaviors? Oh, I'm going to stop eating meat, or I'm going to start recycling, or I'm going to stop using plastic. Like, you can tell everybody these problems. Like, biodiversity report just released, and there's so much information out there. It's really our responsibility to inform ourselves. But do people really change? I don't know. looking at today and our state of affairs, I don't know if we can just solely rely on that. Unless Thanos had like some magical way of making people more aware of it and just more sustainable. I don't even know what that would look like. It probably wouldn't make for a very good movie.
Maybe that's it. But you're reminding me of an important point that I think a number of people writing out there in World Wide Web land have made, or at least a few people about that. And that is that solving overpopulation by cutting the population in half is really not a good solution, because population grows exponentially, and if all he did was eliminate half the people, but he didn't change our behavior in any way, it would be a heartbeat. We would be back up to the same number, right back where we started.
Exactly.
Yeah. And of course, so we needed behavior change to be part of the solution, and it needed to be people choosing smaller families. So if you cut the population in half, but then you said, don't make me do this again, start choosing smaller families,
yeah.
then you might be on track. But you would also need to say, yeah. And by the way, stop being such pigs. Let's cut that overconsumption crap. Now it's starting to sound like a science class movie.
Yeah.
Another point while we're kind of talking about cutting the population in half that I want to make is that, okay, we're at 7.7 billion today. So if we decided, okay, we're all in with this Thanos solution, let's cut the population in half, that would get us down to what? 3.7, 3.8? Yeah, a little over 3.8 billion. Well, guess what?
I round up. I round up. We're like 8 billion. Half of that is 4.
Yeah. Well, guess what? That's not sustainable the way we're living today.
No.
The scientists that have done the most serious inquiry into this estimate that if we were all willing to, in the overdeveloped world, skinny up our lives a little bit and just behave a little better and live a modest European lifestyle, which sounds doable to me, actually sounds kind of fun, the planet could only support about 2 billion people living like that sustainably over the long haul. So we'd have to cut the population in half twice and then change our behavior so that it would stay there.
Yeah.
So just a footnote about that.
I don't think I'm guilty of it as well. I think a lot of it has to do with upbringing, religious affiliation, if you grow up in that sort of home. But I did. And over time, I just started to recognize, but this planet is our home, and separating ourselves from it in a way that just makes us feel like we are so superior that it just doesn't matter what we do to it. We can do whatever we want, and it's always going to be here. It's always going to provide. It's always going to be here for. But that's just not true. You have to take care of it. And so I guess in this conversation that I had with a woman I was talking to about the movie, she really liked the movie. We both really liked the movie. We were talking about that and just the ending. And so at the end of it, I had some criticisms. I said, sure, it's a happy ending. Okay, what do I expect from this movie? But at the end of the day, like, what solution do they really solve? Like, they're going to probably right back at it at the same problem. It's going to happen sooner or later. And even if half of the population didn't come back, I could still see that still being just a repeating problem, because they didn't talk about changing people's behaviors. They didn't talk about why Thanos did it. And so her response to this was, well, Erika, this is human nature. This is this is what we're supposed to do. The whole purpose of life is to survive and reproduce. Like, we're all supposed to have families, and you can't just tell someone that they can't have as many kids as they want. That's human nature. And this planet is going to support that. It has to.
These are not your words. You're
these
not
are
giving
not
us your
my
words.
words. No, I'm like sitting in silence, just baffled. I took a couple minutes to really just let that sit in, and it made me really sad. It made me really sad because I realized, well, you're not the only one that thinks like this. There are a ton of people that think like this.
About 7.6 billion.
Yeah, it made me very sad, because you can't just take and take and take from something and then expect for it to give back. That's just not how things work. I had to play nice. I was at work. I respectfully disagreed.
Silently or?
I did say, well, I respectfully disagree with that. I don't believe that everybody should have as many children as they want. I think that's a very dangerous way to live life. you could have one, you could have two. I mean, I'm not going to tell you how many is too many, but if you really take into consideration the state of affairs and climate and how your family size, your whole existence and their future and their children's future, how that really just affects not just your family, not just you, it affects the entire planet, then you might change your mind. And I would hope that you do.
Yeah.
But
yeah, your story about that conversation and the way just your tone of voice tugged at my heart a little bit, that your sentiments are so heartfelt and you're so thoughtful about it. And I'm hoping that more and more people can really start being more thoughtful. And I don't think Avengers Endgame was a movie that was going to make that happen, unless we just, take advantage of it as a catalyst for more conversations like these. Yeah. But like you, I was kind of impressed with the morality of the heroes, with the heroes willing to sacrifice their lives if necessary in order to bring those other lives back. And I think that that's an interesting place to return to as we try to wrap this conversation up. I was struck by early in the movie, Captain America calmly told Black Widow, "I keep telling everybody that they should move on. Some do, but not us." And then Black Widow says, even if there's a small chance, we owe this to everyone not in this room. And that made me think a little bit about us. I think we are like Captain Marvel and Black Widow in a way. We are superheroes because there's a small chance that we're going to get the world, a very small chance that we're going to save human civilization. I don't know if you would even agree with that, but I think the odds are against us. Yeah, the odds are against us, but we are going to keep trying.
Yeah. I really like that you said that. Thank you for saying that. I get asked all the time, like, whoa. I'm like very borderline obsessive about this topic. And I somehow find a way to bring it into almost every conversation, which I don't know if it's a good thing or if it's a bad thing, but it just, in my mind, it relates to everything. And I want to talk about it. These are things that I want to talk about. And I think that is part of the battle. You have to talk about it if you want people to listen and for people to ask questions and hopefully change their attitudes, change their behaviors. That is really half the battle.
Well, bless you. Bless you. Yeah, we can't just party on while human civilization drives itself right off a cliff.
Right?
Yeah.
Right.
It is time to wrap up, but I thought I would finish with a comment from Reddit. I visited earlier today because I was really just curious to see kind of what the scuttlebutt out there might be about Avengers Endgame, particularly related to overpopulation. So I ended up in the Endgame community on Reddit and thought this was really interesting. I wanted to share. It was posted by Night of Dite. The next major Avengers villain is the coming baby boom post-Hulk snap. Think about it. All around the world, people's spouses and significant others came back to life after being dusted. What do you think they're going to do? The population following this unprecedented boom is going to make people wish for another snap. In other words, there's going to be romantic encounters around the universe because everybody's happy to have their loved one back. They're all going to be making babies tonight. Kind of a funny thought.
Yeah, like what was the solution? Yeah, that is really funny.
For what it's worth. Well, listen, this is something I hadn't even shared with you yet, but we're looking for a co-producer, not another co-host. I'm looking for somebody with good audio editing skills to bring onto the team so that we can get these episodes cranked out a little bit more often. So if you're listening and you have those skills and you might like to contribute them to saving the planet, saving human civilization, send an email to podcast@growthbusters.org. Also, I do want to remind people that they can explore these issues further at growthbusters.org. And if you think this podcast is important, subscribe to the podcast on your podcast app. Rate the podcast and review it. Did you know we only have 5 ratings? That's embarrassing. What's the deal? The good news is they're all 5 stars, so that's good.
Great.
If you go to iTunes and look up the GrowthBusters podcast, you can click on ratings and reviews. You can see that I'm not lying, that we have a stellar rating, but I don't think iTunes is going to show us a whole lot of love if only 5 people have rated us. Because more ratings will help more people discover the podcast, and we're trying to do some good here, so that would be a big help.
This is a pleasure. I hope you enjoyed the movie. I enjoyed the movie. It definitely made for an interesting conversation, and I'm thankful for that.
Well, I'm thankful for you, and I'm thankful for you, the listener. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
Talk later.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather. But no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling. Call the growth busters.